would need to span his entire career and touch on his many accomplishments. And rather than do that incompletely, I prefer to make a complete survey of my relationship to this morning's speaker. So my father, Ryan Collier, works at Virginia State Bar, and he is a very reserved man of few words. And when I asked him if he might be able to recommend an appropriate keynote speaker for day one of the first really jazzy iteration of this institute, it's the second iteration total, but this one has a lot of oomph. He immediately said, "Oh yes, Clarence Dunnaville, that's who you need." And I was bowled over because that's not what I was expecting to hear. And then he specified that he thinks of Clarence as his mentor. And that also surprised me because my father is, being a man of few words, a man of few small entourage, one might say. So I didn't realize that he thought of another person as his mentor. So he feels that Clarence's work in the community is valuable, lasting, and significant on many levels. And I was so pleased to begin a relationship with Mr. Dunnaville over the past few months where we could talk about what this institute could mean for the vision that VCU has going forward in the next decades, how it sees itself as part of this community. And so he's met my son, he's been in our home, and I feel like that this institute has given me the great gift of beginning a friendship with Mr. Dunnaville. So for that, I'm very grateful, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Mr. Dunnaville has to share with us this morning.
Should I? I'm not sure if this is.
Yeah, it has a light mic on it.
Oh, I don't think I need it. But good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'm here because Laura's father introduced me, and I never knew or never considered myself as a mentor. If you know Rodney Coggan, he's a really terrific editor. He is the publisher of the Virginia Lawyer. And over the past, I guess maybe, I'm not sure how many years, but I think it was close to perhaps 20 years, you know, I've written numerous articles, which he's published in his magazine, and he never said no to anything I wrote. But, you know, that has really been my relationship with him. I consider him to be, you know, an excellent editor, and I always stop by to see him when I'm in the building as a friend. But as a mentor, I never considered myself a mentor. I perhaps thought of him as my mentor because I've really engaged in writing so many articles, which he's published, on so many different subjects, but they all relate to the law. And over the last 23 or 4 years, I've practiced in Virginia. I grew up in Roanoke, which is west of here, as you all know, and it's a great little town. But I grew up during the segregation era, and I hated segregation, and I swore from a very small child that as soon as I could, I would leave Virginia and never return. And that is exactly what I did. When I graduated from high school, I got on a bus, a Greyhound bus, and headed north, as far north as my money would carry me, and I was very limited means. But I went to college at Morgan State College in Baltimore, and that was as far north as I could get with the limited money that I had. But it was a great experience, And during my limited experience in Roanoke, I said I hated segregation, and in those days, you can't imagine them having separate restrooms that said white or colored, and separate drinking water fountains. And what I would do from a very small child, as I recall, is as soon as I would see no one looking, I would slip and drink out of the white water fountain. And then when I was old enough to ride the bus, I worked while I was in high school, because that's the way I obtained enough money to go to college, because my father died when I was 10. And my mother had 5 children. I was the oldest. So we really had a rough time growing up. But I worked and saved and was able to get enough money to leave Virginia and head north. And but I had been against segregation from the beginning. And I attended a segregated elementary and high school, and I rode the segregated buses that said white and blacks in the rear, but I would never sit in the rear. I would always stand, which was permissible, and I wouldn't stand in the back. I would stand around the middle, and even if there was no one on the bus but me, I would never sit in the rear. So when I arrived at Morgan, what I discovered was that in Baltimore, I had thought that it was free of segregation. But actually, Baltimore had a lot of segregation. There were segregated restaurants and other things. All of social institutions were segregated. I didn't know that. But buses were not segregated, so I could ride anywhere on the bus and public transportation. And so it really wasn't quite as bad as Virginia. But I did set about in Baltimore at Morgan to changing Baltimore and Maryland to the extent possible. And I joined the different student groups, and I began to picket the segregated theaters with other people, other students. And also I began to, in later years, we began sitting in the segregated restaurants or lunch counters. And you may have read that the segregated lunch counters, it was the Greensboro people who, the students during the 60s, that were the ones who brought about integration in restaurants through picketing and sitting in. But I assure you, we were sitting in way before that. And it was because of the efforts, of our efforts in Baltimore in the 50s, that all of the lunch counters, by the time I graduated from Morgan, were open to everyone. So I've been in this area of inclusion for a long, long time. And from a child, it has been my goal and objective that inclusion is what we need in America. As a matter of fact, you hear people calling people African Americans and so forth now, and I don't agree with that terminology. I consider myself to be just an American of color. It's a lot of difference in my own mind between African Americans and United States citizens of color. And so I consider myself the latter. Now, in Virginia, this business of segregation racial prejudice began long, long ago. From the very beginning, in 1607, King James of England started the colony of Virginia near Williamsburg, and he brought here some people down on their luck who were indentured servants, and they worked the tobacco fields and earned the profit for the capitalists in England, including the king. But the people who came initially, they were people down on their luck, people who had been in prison perhaps, people who may have been begging on the streets of London, but they came here as indentured servants. And after serving out their term, which were usually 5 years or more, they were free and able to become part of the colony of Virginia. But you did have two classes of people. You had the people who formerly were down on their luck and formerly the indentured servants. And then you had the people who were the capitalists and the government officials and the people from the Church of England. And shortly after Virginia was established, just a few years later, in 1614, one of the people who came here, one of the Englishmen, married Pocahontas, who was the daughter of the chief of the Powhatan tribe, who were really from right around here in Richmond, just outside of here. Powhatan County is right over the border. So Pocahontas married John Rolfe, and that was inclusion in the beginning. So we had diversity with the people, the Indian natives, and we had the people from England. And they got along pretty well together initially, and they had some fights. But then, of course, it was James' motive to take over and control all of Virginia, to the exclusion, really, or certainly to the downfall or diminishment of the authority of the Indian tribes. And but they didn't realize that initially. And you had Pocahontas and John Rolfe, and they became very celebrated in England, and she went to England, but she died, unfortunately, and wasn't able to return to Virginia. But her son stayed in England, and she remained as her remains, I believe, are in England. Well, that was the beginning. But going forward from that time, we had diversity. And today, the United States is the most diverse nation on earth. In 1619, a few years later, the first Africans came. And these Africans weren't slaves initially. They were indentured servants, like the white indentured servants. And after serving their terms, they were free, and they mingled with the white former indentured servants. They became landowners, and they intermarried and had children with the former white indentured servants. But the Church of England and the rulers of Virginia, they had ideas, the idea that they were going to stir up the people and keep them fighting with each other, and that served the interest of the people who were the capitalists and the heads of state. So we had, for example, in 1739, there was Bacon's Rebellion, as you students of history may remember. And the former Africans, they were there right along with the other former indentured servants. And in 1812, the former Africans fought in the War of 1812, and they helped save New Orleans. And they got along very well, the former Africans and the former white indentured servants. And many of the white men preferred women of color, and that's why you have so many people today who you see who appear to be near white or almost white, because for generations there's been intermixing of the races. But as I say, the church said before, the church and government officials wanted to stir up trouble, and they got the white indentured servants not liking the Africans, and they also brought slavery in, forced slavery. Now the free people of color, they were different because they'd always been free. But beginning in the middle of the 17th century, there was forced slavery. So you had slavery, which was really the most cruel institution on earth. People were brought here in chains and forced to be slaves, and once there was a slave, the slavery passed forever through the mother. So, you know, this is the posture that America, that Virginia was in when the revolution occurred. And of course, the first person to die was a black person who died in Massachusetts. And he was shot. The first person to die from the American Revolution was a person of color. So the people of color have a long history here. They came, but they've been mistreated throughout their history. And I have been one who've been trying to help to prevent this mistreatment. And inclusion has always been my goal, because as I said, from the very beginning, everybody was included, and the history books really don't say that way, but it's true, and you can check it. Everybody was included. But over the years, because of prejudice, things changed. And so we got to the point where we had the segregation that I grew up with in Roanoke and hated. Now, VCU was started in colonial times, really. The original institution that grew into VCU began during colonial times. And before the Civil War, you had actually VCU, you had the Medical College of Virginia before the Civil War. And it was before the Civil War. It served the Confederacy during the Civil War, and it served after the Civil War. Well, the medical institution was serving a needed purpose, saving lives. And it really wasn't concerned with the politics which existed during the time and which was the cause of the trouble. So that was a very positive thing. Saving people's lives, whether they were Confederates or if Union people, really didn't matter, and they were saving lives, which was the job of the medical profession. But the medical school, the medical hospital continued, and then very early on, it established St. Philip's Hospital, and it established a school for nurses, for nurses of color. So that was an important thing that VCU did in the very early days. So after the Civil War, VCU continued on during the period of the late 1900s, late 1800s, and then the 1900s. And it continued. In the late 1800s, you had the period of Reconstruction first, during the 1870s, 1860s, and 70s, and VCU was involved, the predecessor, MCV, was involved during that period. So that continued. And then, of course, towards the end of the 1800s, in 1896, another shoe dropped on the race thing. You had Plessy against Ferguson. That case was decided by the United States Supreme Court. And Plessy against Ferguson held that schools and institutions, railroads, they could segregate against people on the basis of race as long as they provided equal facilities. Well, of course, the segregation occurred, and it began, it didn't begin because it had existed informally prior to that time, but the segregation continued and was legally, had the force of law, but the facilities were never equal. But the segregation was permitted by Plessy against Ferguson. So going into the 20th century, we have legally permissible racial segregation. And so that was not equal. There was no equality. Schools and other facilities during those years were definitely not of the same quality or caliber for the whites and the blacks. And they continued to deteriorate as you went into the 20th century. Well, in the 20th century, early in the first quarter, something else happened in the racial era, in the racial arena. In 1924, you had the Virginia legislature enacted a law which is called the one-drop rule, which really meant that any person, even if they were white, if they had one drop of non-white blood, they would be classified as non-white, and they could not attend the white facilities. So you could have white people who were really basically white, and years earlier, these people could go into court and have a court declare that they in fact were white if they needed to do for some purpose. These same people were not white after the Act of 1924. So you had a situation where you had segregation and you had this racial integrity statute where the white facilities were only for the people who were pure white. But interestingly, the law contained an exception for those descendants of Powhatan, Pocahontas, which is really incredible. And those people who were descendants of Pocahontas, they were very proud, and you can meet them today, some of them. I know some. And they are very proud of their heritage. But under the law of 1924, the Virginia Racial Integrity Law, they were specifically designated as white. So this racial thing is a crazy thing. It is. And you have to look at it, and when you understand the history as I've related it, you can see how crazy it is. It makes no sense. It never made sense. And what you have is just people stirring up people against other people. People who claim to be superior for no reason. They have no valid reason. And they want to have power over other people. I mean, but as far as superiority or all those other things, it just doesn't exist. So that is the posture that this nation, and Virginia was in the middle of the 20th century. We had gone through this long history that I related. We had this racial integrity law, and we were all segregated against each other and fighting over each other. And one group was asserting that it was superior over the other. Well, there were people like myself, even though I was just a child, but there were people who thought like I thought the same way, that it made no sense. And these people began in actually the late 1940s to attack in these crazy laws. And they went through a series of cases, and by 1954, there was a case which said, this crazy racial thing makes no sense. That case was Brown against Board of Education. And last Saturday, was the 60th anniversary of Brown. And so I'm so pleased to have the opportunity today, 2 days after the 60th anniversary, to talk about this subject, which is one that I've devoted my whole life to. Inclusion. That is what Brown is about. That is what you are about. Inclusion. We have to take everybody, wherever they are, and bring them together, because they are all Americans. Now, because of their economic situation and because of their social conditions, they aren't all the same. And of course, all people aren't the same. Some are more talented than others. some have more skills. And there is no requirement that a great research university include everybody, because you must become the best. And you cannot become the best if you are including people who are not qualified. So your job is to find those people who are the best. And believe me, there are those in every race and group who are outstanding. And you bring them in and include them, and that is how you maintain your status as a great research university. You don't include people who will drag you down. You include people who will pull you up. Now, everybody who might on the surface appear to be a drag you downer isn't a drag you downer. I could say for myself that if one had looked at me back in those days I talked about when I was in Roanoke, they would say I was a drag you downer. I certainly wasn't a scholar. I did not graduate anywhere near the top of my class, even though I don't think anybody in the class was that brilliant, looking back. But I was pretty far down. So those people who are down but want to get up and have the capability to do that, that is your job. Now, some of them might need a little nurturing, a little TLC, and you do that. But your job is when they come out, when they finish this institution, that they will be able to hold their own with anyone, anywhere, and that a VCU student is one that is known throughout the world as a student of accomplishment. That is your job. It is a big one. But people like you have been doing it for a long time. They were able to do it with me. Because I really, when I went into Morgan, I didn't have a clue as to what was going on and how that I could accomplish what I have accomplished in my long life. But those people, they recognized that I had the capability, and they were able to do that. And so that's your job. Now, I mentioned in 1954, this case, Brown against Board of Education, was promulgated by the United States Supreme Court. And that was really a case that was a different case. It set this nation on a different course. Since 1954, we've been on a different course. But there was not an agreement that the states like Virginia would accept that course. There was a tremendous opposition to Brown. When the Brown case came down, the Virginia politicians went nuts. They set up all types of commissions and committees. And Virginia and most of the states in the South spent the next decade fighting to preclude any integration in the school system. And like the justices who wrote the opinion said in that case, diversity is necessary in order for everyone in order to have the very best, to produce the best. You need to get the ideas of everyone. So this is diversity. But the Virginia politicians did not accept that. And they spent the next decade and a half fighting against Brown in every court. There were numerous cases. And I was privileged to, during their latter life, to know some of the people who had made this case. And one of the other things I didn't tell you is that I probably am one of the few people still living who was actually present in the courtroom and heard the argument in Brown against Board of Education. I was a young college student, and and this was in December of 1953. And I was taking a course in political science, and we were studying constitutional law. And somehow my professor got tickets, because you needed tickets, to Washington, the Supreme Court, to see that case. And 3 of us went on that morning. It was December. If you could imagine, it was cold, and there were people out there who had slept out all night. And the streets were lined up with people who were sitting out, sleeping out with sleeping bags, waiting to get in. And of course, the Supreme Court, the chambers where the case was argued, it probably has about as many seats as here in this room. Maybe not as many. So if you can imagine, they had people all the way for a block lined up to take up seats that were probably less than this room. So I said to the professor when we arrived, I didn't know we had tickets. I said, Dr. Walker, we'll never get in. He said, oh, just wait. And at about 11:30, a United States Marshal came out, taking up tickets, and we were able to get in. Well, I had a seat which was about as close as this front row to that argument. And at exactly 12 noon, the court came out from behind some towering red curtains, and the 9 justices appeared in their seats. And seated at the council table, 2 tables, sort of like that, there were the lawyers for the state of Virginia, because the Virginia case was the first case, and the lawyers for the plaintiffs, who represented the people who were successful in getting the result. And that included Spotswood Robinson, whose name is on this courthouse down here. And I was privileged to hear that, along with Thurgood Marshall. And years later, after he retired, I got to meet him. And because I told him that I had been there, and he told me to come by to see him. So I went by and started visiting him. And we became quite good friends before he died, about 10 years later. And he told me some very funny stories. One thing he told me, and I saw him, as I said, when he argued the case, he told me that when he was there to argue the case, and I knew this, of course, the case was not the first matter that the court called. They had a lot of preliminary things they dealt with. That took about an hour before they got to the case. And he told me that he fell asleep. He'd taken some cold medicine or something and fell asleep. and that when the case was called, he didn't realize it, and Thurgood Marshall would sit at the table with him, kicked him on the leg under the table, and he got up and argued the case. Now, he told me that. I was there, and I assure you that he did not skip a beat. And he got up. I, of course, didn't know he would be sleeping, but he was fantastic. He answered every question, and if you could imagine, this Brown case had been going on for more than a year. And the court was just full of questions that they peppered Spotswood with. But it was quite an event. And I was privileged to have been there. Now, in Virginia, as I said before, all of the politicians went nuts. They had all types of commissions and everything to stop this from happening. Included among them, there was a group that was headed by a man named David Mays. And he spent 10 years, I think, figuring out ways to stop integration, including litigation in Virginia. There was a man here who was a lawyer who refused to permit the Richmond schools to close. I don't know if you know of him. His name was Lewis F. Powell, Jr. Anyone here? Justice Powell? Okay. Justice Powell, I call him Justice Powell because he later became a justice of the United States Supreme Court. At that time, when the Brown case was decided, he was the head of the Richmond School Board. He determined not to let the Richmond School Board close. Even though schools were closing all around, he kept the Richmond schools open. And interestingly, he was a lawyer, and his law partners actually represented the state of Virginia. And it was a conflict of interest, really. And he might have possibly been disbarred for this. But he engaged behind the scenes in doing all that he could to, one, preclude the Richmond schools from closing and to get the Virginia schools into complying with Brown. And he worked behind the scenes. He met with people. He wrote a letter to the governor. He did a lot of things to try to prevent the Virginia people from taking the course which they took, notwithstanding his advice. And for the next 15 years, they fought off desegregation or inclusion. By the time this 15-year period elapsed, Lewis F. Powell had been appointed to the United States Supreme Court by President Nixon, and he was sitting up there on the court. So in some of those later cases that came up, because he might have still been around, I'm not certain, when they came up. But what I do know, that he was there in 1978. And that was the year when affirmative action, when that began. That case, the Bakke against the Davis of California Medical School, is the case which decided affirmative action, which is what you base your action on today, inclusion. Justice Powell in his decision 35 years ago, decided that you could take into consideration the race, the racial characteristic of a person in making a decision regarding whether or not to admit them to a college institution. That is known as affirmation. That is inclusion. It was Justice Powell who made that decision. Interestingly, he decided that you cannot use quotas. Quotas are not permitted. You cannot say arbitrarily that we at VCU are going to take 500 people of color into the School of Engineering or whatever. You cannot do that. That would be unconstitutional. But you can take into consideration the racial characteristics together with all other characteristics in making your decisions. Now, that is a much better criterion, because I'll tell you, I went to St. John's University Law School, but I applied to Columbia Law School. I was accepted at both. St. John's was just a fallback school in case I didn't get accepted to Columbia. Columbia wrote me that I was accepted, but their quota for that year was filled, and that I had to wait for the following year to enter Columbia Law School. Of course, I was so angry, I wish I had the letter now. I would blackmail Columbia with it. I tore it up and threw it in the trash can. But I would have been accepted if they had taken into consideration the racial characteristics and all the other criterion. I graduated in the top of my class. I was the president of this and that organization. I was received the President's Award, called the President's Second Mile Award, from the President of the University graduation. I would have been, in my view, accepted under any standards. So I believe that I would have been accepted to that class that year if they had been allowed to take into account racial characteristics and everything, and had not had this quota. So I think that the criteria which you have is far better and far superior to a quota. And that Justice Powell, a native of Richmond, a good Virginia gentleman, a very conservative person, by the way, paved the way for all of this. And he should be remembered for his efforts in that regard. Now, that subject of admission of people of color has gotten a tremendous amount of attention in the last week. I don't know if you've watched TV and seen, there's been a lot of programs about it. The subject you're talking about this week is very, very timely. It's been on all of the networks, and this past week, there's an article this week in the Atlantic magazine dealing with it. That article deals with the whole idea of inclusion. And one of the things that's brought out is that we're going back to where we started 60 years ago. That the all-black schools are radiating everywhere. and that in the South in particular, today, there are segregated schools just as much as they were in 1954, before Brown was decided. That is a problem for this country. As a result, they're back at giving lesser resources to those segregated schools. You may find in your recruitment that some of the students are not up to speed because they've not received equal education in high school. So that is something you have to deal with. And I suggest during the course of your deliberations this week that you talk about those things and your involvement in the community. I heard someone mention something, I think this morning as I came in. I think that VCU, as an urban institution, has a unique opportunity to get to know and become a part of the community, and that you can affiliate with parts of the community and become very active in the community, and that can be your strong suit. And you can use that as a laboratory in your research. That, I think, enables you to become a greater institution. The very astute use of the resources that you have by virtue of your location in the central city. So my suggestion in your deliberations is that you think of that and become a part of the community in your deliberations.